In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. My Lord and my God, I firmly believe that you are here, that you see me, that you hear me. I adore you with profound reverence. I ask your pardon for my sins and the grace to spend this time of prayer fruitfully. My Immaculate Mother, Saint Joseph, my Father and Lord, my guardian angel, intercede for me. We begin our prayer on the second day of Lent, going back to a scene recounted in the fifth book of the Bible, Deuteronomy, which Moses composed on the 40th year of the long pilgrimage of the chosen people from Egypt across the Sinai, finally stopping at Moab shortly before crossing over to the Promised Land. Moab was like a mountain that drops down to the Jordan, such that from the height of the Moab, you see the vast expanse of Israel, the Promised Land. And we read, Moses spoke to the people and said, "Now, Israel, hear the statutes and decrees which I am teaching you to observe, that you may live and may enter in and take possession of the land which the Lord, the God of your fathers, is giving you. Therefore, I teach you the statutes and decrees as the Lord my God has commanded me, that you may observe them in the land you are entering to occupy. Observe them carefully, for thus will you give evidence of your wisdom and intelligence to the nations, who will hear all these statutes and say, 'This great nation is truly a wise and intelligent people.' For what great nation is there that has God so close to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him? Or what great nation has statutes and decrees that are as just as this whole law which I am setting before you today?" On this second day of our 40-day retreat, it's like, just like the chosen people, we too are crossing the desert. One can put the desert in different levels: the desert of a pandemic, the desert of Lent, the desert of a life which up to now perhaps had not been very clear, but which we want to clarify. It's very important to understand the meaning of our life. What set apart the chosen people, the whole idea of God setting apart the people, starting with Abraham, taking him out of that pagan place, which was Ur, which, as I told you yesterday, is the present day Iraq. Culturally quite advanced, rivaling Egypt in its culture, but morally, ethically, quite depraved. Because that's what happens with man's fallen nature left to its own devices. If you get a piece of machinery or whatever that is defective and you run it, it can't possibly get better. It can only get worse. And that's what happened with human nature after the fall. Left to its own devices, it was just drifting farther and farther away from the ideal. And that's the reason why God had to intervene. And he started intervening actively. That's what we call salvation history, precisely with the constitution of the chosen people, the people of Israel that started with Abraham. But what set them apart from the rest of the nations, as here we see Moses telling them, extolling them just before they enter the Promised Land? It's good to have as we said yesterday, la composición del lugar, the context, contextualization of what we're reading in sacred scripture. Abraham happened about 2,000 years BC. Moses around 1,500 or 1,400. David around the year 1,000. So those are the big landmarks in the history of the chosen people. But still, that's 1,500 years, 1,400 years BC, the time of Moses. And that's pretty primitive as far as the chosen people were concerned. Remember that they were enslaved in Egypt for quite a while, for about, 300 years maybe. And so escaping from Egypt, going to the promised land, they were a nomadic culture, subsisting in the desert, thanks to the providence of God who led them from one watering place to another. They'd go to a well, a what do you call this thing? A well. And they'd camp there, perhaps to stay there for 2 years, a couple of years or 3 years until they had, especially that they had sheep. The sheep had obliterated all the grass and the herbs, and then they'd break camp, and God would lead them to another well. And it was like that for 40 years. If you look at the map, you'll see that the distance between Egypt and Israel is very short. They could have done that trip in a week at most. But it took them 40 years precisely because God was leading them around. As I said, a whole generation had to die. It was a time of purification. But in all of that, the chosen people could claim a superiority as regards their neighbors, those cultures, the culture of Iraq, the culture of Egypt, farther away, the culture of China and India, across the world, the Minoan culture in the Mediterranean, that they could claim a superiority not in the sciences, not in engineering, not even in philosophy or astrology or astronomy rather, but they could claim a superiority in the ethical life, precisely because they had what we would call now a código. They had a guide, and that was the Ten Commandments. Those 2 tablets that God gave to Moses containing, shall we say, the tenets, the principles of the natural law. So as I said earlier, on the second day of the retreat, let's start from the very beginning. The meaning of our existence, the meaning of the whole universe is in the will of God. With the leisure that this quarantine provides us, the leisure that the Lenten season provides us, I invite you to open the Bible and let us meditate on the meaning of God's law. With the very first book, the very first chapter. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the face of the waters. Thus he began the first book of Moses, commonly called Genesis, in which the prophet, based on divine inspiration regarding events that happened long before his time, recounts the origin of the universe, of man, his original nature and gracing, and his fall, and God's plan of salvation for fallen man. It's a great book, presenting a summary of salvation history, which would unfold in all the succeeding books of the Old and the New Testaments, to end in that apocalyptic vision of Saint John in the last book of the New Testament. It is the greatest book that has been written, whose principal author is God, making use of the human author to put context and human usage to the inspired message. Instead of separating 3-in-1 coffee to its component powders, as somebody posted in social media at the beginning of this pandemic, when people can't do anything else, as an extreme manifestation of boredom, why not read the passages of the Bible that I shall be citing these days? In the beginning, before God created anything, there was no time, because time is defined as numerus motus, the measure of change, the before and after of things. Before there were things, there was only God, and God is eternal. God is unchanging. God is in complete possession of everything that he can be, always. There's no potency in him. There's no becoming in him. He just is in the present tense. And because God is unchanging eternally, then there can be no time. Because time is just a measure of the before and after. There's no before and there's no after in God. It's always now. So what that statement really meant is that in his eternity, God created the heavens and the earth, and then time began. So instead of saying in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, terms which were understandable to the Jews, the Israelites of the desert, Moses was talking to them. What really happened was God created the heavens and the earth, and time began. The whole of the created material universe was created in a moment. And from that moment, nothing new has been added to that physical universe. As a matter of fact, physics bears this out. The famous law of conservation of mass and energy, the very first principle of thermodynamics, the summation of mass plus the summation of energy equals a constant. Meaning to say that the whole created universe was there from the very beginning. So what was happening is just a transformation of one form of matter to another, or one form of energy to another, or even the transformation between mass and energy through Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. But everything was there from the very beginning. Beyond the material consideration of the whole process, however, what is interesting for us now, since this is not a class in thermodynamics, but a meditation, is the spiritual message of that, or those verses of sacred scripture. The whole thing did not happen by chance, neither in its beginning, creation, nor in its unfolding, evolution and human history. Because it says there, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the waters. The Spirit of God was moving over the waters. The Hebrew word used was something very specific for that Spirit of God. What was used was really the Hebrew word ruah, which means breath. Had that been translated to English, the translation would have been the breath of God was moving over the waters, or God was breathing over the waters. What is this breath? What is this exhalation of God? That reveals a fundamental truth regarding creation. God was not only the origin of creation and author, but also the manager, the provider. Contrary to the deist idea of Freemasonry, that the divine architect created the universe and left it there. Contrary to that, God continues keeping everything, not only keeping everything in their being, but managing them in their unfolding. This is the reason, the need to communicate with him. Indeed, it is the reason for our hope. Nothing happens outside the will and providence of God. That is why St. Paul would exclaim later on that for those who love God, everything works together unto good. Why? Because in principle, the unfolding of the universe is planned by God for the good. Unfortunately, for those who move outside of that plan, perhaps not aware of it, well, they get run over. By the will of God, they got run over by the rest of the universe. And that's what misfortune really consists in. Imagine a player in a football field, especially American football, those big, hunky people. Imagine a player who doesn't know the play. And then he gets clobbered, he gets run over just because he didn't know the play. Everything works for the good for those who love God. And there is the rub. Because many times in this vast universe where there is an order, man, the free being, doesn't know or doesn't care what that order is. Well, let's keep this in mind. In this vast universe, there is order. In stark violation of yet another physical generalization, the so-called third law of thermodynamics, or the law of maximum entropy, which simply state that things tend towards maximum randomness. We do observe order in our solar system, and order even in our own planet, Earth. Periodic climate changes, periodic seasons, periodic table of elements, chemical laws, biological laws, behavioral patterns of animals, etc. So true is this that the observation of such order, what the Greeks already called teleology, or that things tend toward their proper ends, they have a finality, led St. Thomas Aquinas to the fifth way to demonstrate the existence of God. Because such an order cannot be by itself. A divine architect, a mind who knew things, who knew order, who knew purpose, must have created and must be managing all that. Otherwise, yes, the law of maximum chaos, maximum entropy would set in. That's why the observation of the harmony in creation inevitably leads the rational mind towards the certainty that not only that there is an architect behind it, that's the Masonic idea, but equally important that there is a conductor behind that symphony, divine providence. For all the material universe, the eternal law of its creator was simply imprinted in its being. Even the so-called periodic table of elements, that for most people is almost just a piece of decoration, but for a chemist like me or a physicist actually enshrines a law that enables them to predict the possible existence of elements, perhaps until now unknown or only detectable momentarily in particle accelerators, to fill up those squares in that table, simply because such a square rather reflects a stable set of variables, the so-called quantum numbers, that describe the possible stable configuration of electronic orbitals. If you look at the periodic table, it's periodic. You can project it, even if there's nothing in some squares yet. You know that there must be an element somewhere that should fill up those squares, because that's what physics dictate. But not so with man. Man is much more than just chemical and physiological processes or even behavioral patterns, because man is made in the image of God and elevated to his likeness. This we read too in Genesis. Then God said, after he had created everything else, on the sixth day of creation precisely, sixth day, which is, days of 24 hours, but sixth period of time. Then God said, let us make man in our image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God made man in his own image. In the image of God, he made him, male and female, he made them. To be made in the image of God means to be spiritual like him. even if man also has a material component, the body, we have more than that, a spiritual component. Unlike plants and animals that are purely material, man has a spiritual soul. The life principle, the vivifying principle that makes a living being alive, that's what we call the soul. For plants and animals, that soul is reducible to a set of physiological mechanisms that can even be written out in a blackboard or in a whiteboard nowadays. But for man, what makes us alive is not just physiological mechanisms. What keeps us alive is a spiritual principle, our soul. Such that without that soul, the body is dead. There was a time when some people, philosophers, thought that man also had a soul like the animals, an animal soul. And on top of that, a spiritual soul. That's actually the philosophical explanation or theory behind zombies. Zombies are people who have lost their spiritual soul and it's just the animal soul. That's the reason why they're just moving around like animals, slow at that, although they're supposed to be fast varieties also if you've been following those zombie movies. But that's not true, of course, because precisely man doesn't have a purely animal soul, either a spiritual soul or nothing. Either we are spiritually animated with a soul that is capable of thinking and of willing freely, or the physiological mechanisms stop and we're dead. Well, the special people were special because of, instead of just leaving them to their limited intellects, and this applies to us too, to figure out God's eternal law for them as applied to man, the natural law, God positively revealed to them his will, enshrined in those 10 commandments and those 2 tablets. In other words, for the chosen people, as an immediate preparation for the coming of the Messiah, God made sure that there would be this nation who would have an ethics sufficiently elevated, sufficiently right, so that the Son of God can come and start teaching them about more sublime realities. Because think about it. Without that preparation, if Jesus Christ would have been born, for example, in Iraq at that time, in Ur, then perhaps the minute he opened his mouth, he would have been crucified. The Judeo-Christian tradition is like a path, a process. First, there had to be the Jews. First, there had to be people who would understand a lot more of what human nature is and what God's plan is before that revelation is perfected by the coming of the Messiah, the Son of God made man. And that's the meaning of our existence. We form part of that race. We form part of that nation. We form part of that lineage. We're not lost in space. The reason why we entitled this series Crossing the Desert is because willfully, intelligently, we can cross the desert. It's just like the chosen people who were wandering around the desert, but not aimlessly. God was leading them. We too are supposed to go through life, not aimlessly, but led by divine providence, first of all, in revelation, but also because making use of revealed truth, making use of our own intellect and our freedom, we're supposed to map out, to chart our own destiny. That's the reason for our temporal existence on earth. I promised myself yesterday, after I gave the first meditation, that I would try to end my meditation 5 minutes before the time, to leave you some time to think on your own, to formulate your resolutions. I'd like to start doing this now. There are 5 minutes left before making the 30-minute meditation. Do it on your own now. And as we progress through this retreat, I will even give you more time, because this has to be your own conversation with God. I give you the tools. I give you the outline. I give you even the bullet points for your conversation, but you have to carry out your own prayer, because otherwise you would have just listened. Otherwise, perhaps I would have just given you a class or entertained you. That's not the point. You have to have your own conversation with God.